So the following is a dialogue that I had with John Torday, who is a professor of pediatrics and evolutionary medicine at the UCLA Medical School. He's also the director of the Gunther Lab for Cell Molecular Biology. And as you'll hear, John is very interested in a novel approach to evolution that focuses on cellular organization. We discussed that as well as John's interest in Whitehead's philosophy of organism. We talked about the sociology of science and the difficulty of bringing forth new paradigms. And we also talked about the importance of inter and even transdisciplinary research. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. So I guess let me start by just sharing a bit about my role at the Cobb Institute. This conversation was precipitated because you had reached out to John Cobb Jr., sharing some of your work and your interest in Whitehead. And John sent that along to me because for the last 10 months or so, I've been the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. I myself am not a scientist, I'm a philosopher coming out of a study of Whitehead's work and with a deep interest in natural philosophy and really trying to integrate the various levels, so-called, of the scientific understanding of the universe, from physics to chemistry to biology and psychology and sociology and so on, just trying to understand, with Whitehead's help and some other natural philosophers, how all of these different scientific disciplines can kind of hang together as a whole. And I know that your work, I don't know how long you've been intrigued by this understanding of evolution as a sort of energetic continuum that links the Big Bang and the singularity out of which our universe originated to the evolutionary process of living organisms. But that is certainly a hypothesis or an approach to the study of life that very much resonates with me as I'm trying to understand evolution, not just as a biological process, but ultimately as a cosmological process that takes on different forms. There's sort of an evolution of evolution at these various levels or scales of the universe. So
Matt, you know that I spoke at the university about 4 years ago.
which one?
At the process.
Oh, the Center for Process Studies. Oh, no, I did not realize that. And what was that lecture on?
The stuff that I shared with you.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Although honestly, I didn't realize I was going into Whitehead land. I don't remember how I ended up lecturing there, but Dr. Cobb was in the audience.
Okay, I didn't know that background.
Yeah. So just so you know.
Great. So, well, I guess let's start with your interest in Whitehead, and then we'll from there. I'd love to hear more about your research. Why is it that you have found that Whitehead's work is relevant to your research on cellular communication and evolution?
It's kind of multifactorial. My lab at UCLA actually does epigenetic research. We've been funded by the NIH for more than a decade to study the effects of nominally of cigarette smoking on childhood asthma. It's a well-known phenomenon, and it actually broke out. USC group showed that it's actually whether your grandmother smoked, which got our attention because that suggested a transgenerational mechanism, which we've worked out using nicotine as a proxy for the 3,000 other components in smoke. At any rate, showing that if you administered nicotine to a mother rat during gestation, you see the asthma phenotype for at least 3 generations following. We didn't go any further because it got too expensive to follow all these animals. But my point is that was direct evidence, and there's more and more evidence that epigenetic inheritance directly from the environment is a real phenomenon. Lamarck was right. And in fact, I've concluded that Darwin, first of all, there's no scientific evidence for Darwinian evolution, which is problematic. And furthermore, I think that Darwin was just looking at the epiphenomenon of the adults and how they interact to generate offspring. But in reality, it's all about the zygote. the zygote actually remains static or at equipoise because, and I say that in all candor, because the way that epigenetic inheritance works is obtaining data from the environment and incorporating it into the DNA of the egg or the sperm. We've shown that. Others have shown that too. So in other words, I think that the life cycle is actually zygote to zygote, which would explain, for example, why it is that a mayfly lives only 24 hours and a sequoia lives 5,000 years. It's the differences in the strategy that's being used to cull information from the environment, which is constantly changing in order to be able to evolve in the most effective and efficient way. But in terms of Whitehead, I had tried reading Whitehead, and it was very confusing to me. But then it dawned on me, I became convinced that we were looking at the wrong end of the telescope in terms of biology itself and evolution, and we know that reasoning after the fact is illogical, but it's all we had until I came along and said, oh, wait a minute, but we have these cellular communication mechanisms which would allow us to deconvolute the evolutionary strategy. And I'm a lung biologist by training and avocation. There's a tremendous amount of data to indicate that, to be able to create a schematic, which I did for what the alveolus of the lung looks like. The alveolus is the working principle. It's these little spheres that within our lungs. There are 3 million of them per person, if you will. At any rate, and when I created the schematic for this review, which appeared on the cover of Pediatric Research in 2009, I think it was, I stepped back and I said, well, either this whole construct is what Fukuyama referred to as neutral theory. Given enough time, things happen, or there was some underlying set of principles. And when it did the probability of whether the two primary germinal cells, the endoderm and mesoderm, which interact to generate the lung and other structures, biologic structures, how long that would have taken, based upon what I knew, it would have taken longer than the existence of the universe. So that was a nonsense answer. So the default mode was, well, there must be some underlying set of principles. And that's exactly what I did. I worked my way back as best I could from the contemporary human lung, mammalian lung, to the reptilian, avian, amphibian lung. And now we know that, contrary to popular belief, the lung is not, it did not evolve from the gills of fish. That's an analogy. It's a homology. The lung evolved from the swim bladder. The swim bladder actually has the same features as the lung, but it serves a different purpose. It maintains the fish so that it can efficiently feed by controlling buoyancy, but it's still supplying food, and it's a gas-filled structure. So a group in Singapore showed that the top 50 genes in the development of the swim bladder are exactly the same as that in a mouse lung or a human lung, for that matter, among other things. At any rate, so I'm getting a little off track here, but what I wanted to say was that in terms of Whitehead, it occurred to me that, so the way that embryology or pattern formation occurs, and embryology is the only mechanism we know to date for biology for forming structure and function. So it's a powerful way of understanding that process. And the way that it works is that there are these cellular communication mechanisms. There are growth factors that are signaling from one cell type to another to either grow or differentiate. Those are actually high energy phosphates. They're energy. So in reality, we focus on stuff when in fact we should be focusing on energy patterns, because the patterns of development ultimately culminate in physiologic control. And that in turn is another form of energetic regulation. So basically, we go through the life cycle by transferring the energy that originated from the sun, thermal energy, to an organification of energy in animal terms, if you will. And then ultimately, because of the canting of energy towards the beginning of the life cycle in order to ensure reproductive success, in later life, those signaling mechanisms fail because the mitochondria basically give it up and you don't have enough energy. And so those signaling mechanisms will systematically fail. That's senescence, and then we die. But in the interim, we pass our genetic information on to the next generation. So that's the sort of big picture way that I look at it, and how I think, I mean, obviously, as you know, I mean, Whitehead was using deductive reasoning. I'm providing everything I say is based upon experimental evidence. And the other reason I think strongly that this is correct is because, in fact, the unicellular state is a complete form in and of itself. The cytoskeleton of the unicellular organism determines whether the cell is either homeostatic, meiotic, or mitotic. And that can actually be manipulated. And there's a specific gene that regulates that process, that servos that mechanism of the cytoskeleton to all of the functions of the cell. It's the target of rapamycin gene, which was actually discovered when they treated rats or mice with rapamycin. It's an antibiotic. Turns out that it extends lifespan. That's not coincidental. That's getting at this central feature of what the purpose of life is. I believe it's purely to collect data and to ensure that the organism perpetuates itself and sustains itself as well. So, yeah.
So you're suggesting that the complex physiology of multicellular organisms is in some way, all of these traits are evolved from the cell membrane of unicellular organisms, right? And so that,
Right.
in your view, the unit of selection, or the primary agent of selection, as it were, would be the cell, rather than trying to look at the functions of complex phenotypes as somehow being having functions that can be selected for in a Darwinian way. You think that's epiphenomenal, and that what's really going on is this cell-to-cell communication?
Yeah, you know, the tangled bank in Darwin's Origin of Species, you know, myriad forms most beautiful, blah, blah, blah. Phenotype is usually thought of as being this laundry list of traits. It's actually, the phenotype is actually agency, the ability to interface with the environment and determine, distinguish signal from noise. And I think that the fast track to the idea that, in fact, lateralization, left-right brain, actually is the way that we detect quantum level information. And the reason I think that that's true is because we originate. So when I reverse engineered the process of evolution based upon lung biology, but it works for kidneys and skin and brain, they all ultimately end up in the unicellular state. As you were saying, the cell membrane being the sense organ for determining outside and inside. I came to the realization that the way that the cell is, so the big bugaboo of quantum mechanics and biology is decoherence. The physicists say it's impossible to have a quantum level scale existing in a biologic system interfacing with the sloppy, wet, you know, Newtonian classical mechanics. But if you interject the cellular signaling mechanisms, they are what allow for that relationship between the quantum level and the Newtonian level. And in fact, starting with, oh, I'm sorry, I was going with the idea of, so I think that it's actually lipid micelles, these prototypical cells that were formed from lipids generated by pulsars in deep space and also in certain thermal vents. They actually are what are called amphiphiles. So lipids are bipolar. They have a negative and positive end. They line up at the surface of the air-water interface vertically. And that's the first symmetry of life as we understand it. And then you have phenomena like deuterostomes forming from from our anus to our mouth. That's how we develop. The autonomic nervous system, the vagus, similarly goes from back to front, starts with the adrenals, moves through the gut to the heart, to the face, to the brain. So all of that, in my opinion, is in service to the fact that we start out in an ambiguous state, Schrodinger's negentropy in the unicell, and that is a paradox. But we cope with that through the ability to essentially cope with uncertainty principle. we're coping with the uncertainty by overlaying it with another form of uncertainty, this asymmetry. So the two together give you a way for the organism to be able to interact with its environment in a way which is conducive to life itself and to its perpetuation. So that's why I say the idea that left-right brain, why would the left side of the cerebrum control the right side of the body and vice versa? It kind of is counterintuitive until I thought, oh, well, but maybe that's the way that we have evolved to be able to countenance and to interface with quantum mechanical principles.
Very interesting. So to back up for a minute and examine the Darwinian approach to evolution, I want to know more about your critique of it. I understand it's put forward as an explanation for the evolution of whatever trait, but in your terms, it's more of a description, and it's a kind of just so story. Strictly speaking, logically, the Darwinian mechanism is almost tautological. Like this trait has survived because it has survived. But in your view, you're concerned with the form of teleological explanation, or like Ernst Mayr would call it teleonomic explanation, that's an after the fact account of what we think might have happened in the past to select for the gradual development of a specific trait that we can see in the present in a given organism. And you're unhappy with that teleological mode of explanation, if it even is an explanation. It's more of a descriptive account. It's a story, it's a narrative, right? And you're trying to reverse engineer the sort of on a both ontogenetic and phylogenetic level, the gradual development of more complex organisms from cellular signaling and communication, so that you can give a true explanation. And you use the term a mechanistic explanation that shows step by step in terms of the genetic networks and the proteins that are necessary, for example, for the cell, for the lungs to develop. And that if this was just a matter of random mutation being selected by the environment, it would probabilistically take more than the history, the age of the universe. And so there's something else going on here. And if we draw on Whitehead, he wanted to legitimize a different kind of aim or purpose in the natural world. It's not the sort of aim that, say, an intelligent design theorist would describe, where there's some sort of a designer who imprints a blueprint onto the universe that then gets obeyed. Rather, for Whitehead, aims are more kind of stochastic, and there's a plurality of aims, and it's more of a groping process. But in his view, there is still a teleology of the universe, and he says it's toward beauty, which we could understand as towards greater coherence and greater complexity, more intense experience, and so on. And so does this philosophical understanding coming out of Whitehead of the place of purpose in the universe and in evolution, does that have a role in your understanding, or is it more just the processual and the sort of energetic account of nature that you're interested in Whitehead's philosophy?
I don't disavow what Whitehead says. I just take exception to, the problem. I think that the problem is, the one thing I think that we all acknowledge is that there's something greater than ourselves, and we use whatever narrative it is that gets us by, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the key experiment I did, I was funded by the National Institutes of Health to study parathyroid hormone-related protein for 30 years. Because if you delete that gene, you don't get alveoli. It was critically important. And that gene duplicated, amplified, in the transition from water to land about 500 million years ago, along with two other receptor genes, the glucocorticoid receptor and the beta-adrenergic receptor. The reason for that is the stress of transition from water to land was huge. And so these particular receptor genes for hormones, local and endocrine, were critically important for that transition of bony fish specifically Physostomous fish, which have a tube that connects the trachea, the esophagus to the swim bladder. It's a trachea, okay? Okay, because there's another type of bony fish, Physoclystis fish, which they do a trick more like what a kidney does by extracting stuff from the circulation. That's not how we evolved. My point being that the PTHRP gene is mechanically regulated. It's sensitive to stretching of the cell that makes it. And so I did a critical experiment about 20 years ago, putting these long and bone also does the same thing. It's calcium, calcification of bone is also stretch regulated. We know that's Wolff's law. If you deform bone, it will recalcify in order to accommodate that physical force. So I got this device from NASA that allows you to put cells in essentially zero gravity. And when you do that, the cells lose their phenotype. They're dependent upon gravity. Gravity, and Spooner and Klassen had published a paper earlier, actually, and I only stumbled onto it recently, showing that these lipid protocells will not form in zero gravity. So the gravitational force, which is one of the four forces generated by the Big Bang, is necessary for life. And life is the blowback, the reaction to gravity. Because I think that homeostasis is the recoil of the Big Bang. So every balanced equation, whether it's physics, chemistry, or biology, that equal sign is the homeostatic reaction to Newton's third law. Okay, and that's where life begins. It's through this pushback against the cosmos, and the key element, and no one else has suggested. Everyone else who talks about the nature of life and the cosmos and how they relate has never coupled that idea with Lynn Margulis's symbiogenesis theory, that the way that we've evolved, and Lynn did, her first step was bacteria being engulfed by the cell to form mitochondria. Lynn was a professor of mine at Boston University. And later in life, when I was at Harvard Medical School, we intersected at a journal club that she used to attend at BU. Anyway, and I talked to her 6 months before she died. At any rate, but the point I'm trying to make is that coupling of physics and biology, the internalization of the physical world by our cells, that's the intersection of physics and biology. That's where everything coalesces. So so basically the synchronic approach is to accept everything en face as is. The diachronic is going across space-time, and when you do that, you eliminate the material, and all that's left is the energy flow. That's why I like Whitehead, because he's right. But he's doing it based upon, building it out of whole cloth. Everything I've done to build this idea comes from linked events experimentally that have the same magnitude, same direction and relative magnitude, following this Big Bang trajectory, this vector that Einstein described in that dream he had when he was 16 years old, which was the nidus for his wonder year. Why else would you have thought of Brownian movement, photoelectric effect, and special relativity all in the same breath, if you will? Because he had this privileged perspective. He was standing outside of the cosmos. He was looking in, and he was seeing everything occurring in a continuum. At least I think. I had a close friend who he's an astrophysicist, and he was the one who he got his physics degree from Hebrew University, where Einstein's papers reside, and he created an exhibition at the Natural History Museum in New York, where he works, and then at the Skirball in LA, where I was living at the time. And he walked us through my wife and I through the exhibit, and I'm seeing this progression. And I turned to him, I said, this guy had a very interesting perspective on the cosmos. And this guy had never thought of that, but I think that that's true. I think that that's what was happening. And there are other people who've had, Otto Loewy, the discovery of whatever Otto discovered, some humoral factor, or Archimedes jumping out of the bathtub. It's the same, and I don't think it's any different from a near-death experience. I've had one. I was in a high-speed rollover accident on the 405 in 2004. I thought I was driving at the time, but I was sitting in the back seat watching it as if it were a video, and I was just shades of gray and black and just waiting to die. Very accepting of it. I think that you can transcend from the physical, what we think of as, Bohm's explicate, and we approximate the implicate through experimentation. I mean, the experiment of a rollover accident is not one I recommend, but I think, and what I think happens is, and I'm just publishing a paper on hormones and reality saying that's a wave collapse. That's coherence of calcium waves. And the reason you see that light at the end of the tunnel in a near-death experience, that's a calcium burst. The same calcium burst that initiated the zygote when the sperm fertilized the egg. We know that that's a calcium burst. It's been documented. So I don't know if that's making sense, but I see that there is a way in which you can visualize the entire process in a continuous way that is testable and refutable. It's very Popperian actually, and which I feel is very important.
Yeah, no, definitely. Whitehead's a speculative philosopher, and even when he's working with physics, it's as a mathematical physicist. So he's not, he wasn't involved in the testing of his various metaphysical hypotheses, though I think they do have implications for laboratory researchers, and it's exciting to see some of that panning out now in your research and others. What I love about your work, and you're connecting this to near-death experiences, and in one of your papers I read, you also mentioned the ability of yogis to slow their metabolism, and what this for me is an indication of is the inadequacy of what Whitehead called the bifurcation of nature, which is something he articulates in his 1920 book, The Concept of Nature. And in that book, at that time in his career, he was not yet doing metaphysics. He was just beginning to come out of mathematics and physics and doing philosophy of science. And he was critical in that book of the bifurcation of nature, which is the sort of split between what Galileo called primary and secondary characteristics, right? The primary characteristics are all the things that can be measured and mathematized, and the secondary characteristics are the subjective, qualitative dimensions, the smells, the tastes, the colors, and so on. And Whitehead thought that, look, this is incoherent metaphysically, and we need to overcome this bifurcation and see in some way how the electric waves, electromagnetic wavelengths by which the physicist would describe and explain the light and color of a sunset needs to somehow hang together with the way that a nature poet would reflect upon its beauty. These are both aspects of one universe. And so when I hear you describe the connection between a near-death experience and calcium molecules, and it to me is an indication that yes, this bifurcation doesn't work, and that in some ways our consciousness and the biological and physical processes that support it are intimately linked. And so it's kind of Whitehead's not an idealist. He's not saying it's all happening in consciousness, but nor is he a materialist who would describe everything in a merely push and pull mechanism kind of way, and then all of a sudden, because neurons are arranged in some special way, consciousness appears for the first time in the universe. He's trying to articulate a kind of gradient or a spectrum of experiential intensity, right? Human consciousness is obviously very sophisticated and what he would call a high grade form of experience that's perhaps pretty rare in the universe. I mean, maybe life is pretty rare, we're not sure yet. But nonetheless, for Whitehead, going down to the simplest form of energetic event, there is some sort of, there's something it's like to be, even a photon or an electron. And this is where the aim comes in, right? Whitehead would say that the vibration of a molecule and its unique vibratory signature, right? Every molecule, every protein is vibrating in a certain way, and that's part of where its function comes from, right? And Whitehead would say that vibratory signature is what we measure as a vibration is felt by that molecule as some form of experience, and that there's an aesthetic dimension to it. Now, this is very speculative, obviously, but from a philosophical point of view, when we're trying to understand consciousness and its origins, there's the hard problem of consciousness that I imagine you're probably familiar with. And that problem only originates because we think we're starting with something purely, Whitehead would call it vacuous, in the sense that there's no experience present in the physical and maybe most of the biological universe until nervous systems evolve. That would be the typical story. But Whitehead's got a different view of this. It's more of a continuous view. And I wonder if, in your research in the laboratory, obviously you're not going to be able to prove one way or another what Whitehead is talking about here, but do you think that there's still, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, maybe you could speak to that, but do you think that there's room for this kind of a speculation about the nature of the universe?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think my gravity experiment, and by the way, people at Boston University had done the same microgravity experiment with yeast and showed that the yeast cannot polarize, i.e. they can't conduct a calcium wave, and they can't reproduce. They're zombies, okay? But in terms of the Chalmers' heart problem, I think that that's an atavism. It's when you whack your thumb with a hammer, you're remembering that atavistic state in which you first had a nervous system to go ow and a circulatory system to bleed. Just no different from the innate fear of spiders and snakes. We evolved from these small shrew-like animals back 500 million years ago. And yeah, we had to be aware of these threats to our lives. And there actually are epigenetic experiments in which people have shown. There's a wonderful experiment. I put this idea out. It flashed into my head at one point. I thought, does a butterfly have caterpillar dreams? And this friend of mine comes back and says, John, they've done the experiment. So what they showed was that if they took caterpillars, they have a certain pheromone smell that they really love. And if they exposed the caterpillar to the pheromone, and in the test group, they shocked them as well. When they became butterflies, when the butterflies were exposed to the pheromone, they freaked out because it was like they were experiencing the electrical pulse again. Okay. So I think that our memory, our consciousness is really embedded in our peripheral nervous system, this is just a concentrated, state of neurons. And in fact, the big breakthrough in brain evolution was Nick Holland at UC San Diego saying, well, the reason we can't get from invertebrates that don't have a central nervous system, or we don't think it does, to people, organisms with highly focalized central nervous systems, is because the worm has its its central nervous system in its skin. It's the skin-brain hypothesis, which then reverts back to the cell membrane of unicellular organisms. I think that there is a lineage there. Right. So yeah, we're anthropomorphizing. Anthropic principle is ridiculous. The idea that we've got plopped here in that Garden of Eden. We aren't as Sagan used to say at the end of his Cosmos show back in the 80s, we are made of star stuff. We're not in this universe. We are of it. We are part and parcel of it. That's why there is this intimacy between us, our memory, and the cosmos. Right. Our immediate consciousness is working off the same software as the cosmos is, the laws of nature.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying about gravity is another indication to me that some of the folks that are talking about human beings going to Mars and being able to restart civilization there. I mean, the gravity is different there. It's 1/3 of the Earth's gravity, and that we have this, I think, overly abstract understanding of life as something that's just sort of transposable to another planet, which doesn't take into consideration the extent to which it totally depends on the environment of the Earth, right? And it's the gravitational force of the Earth, its relationship to the moon and its tidal effects, and the distance from the sun, and all these things that are environmental conditions and rhythms that make the life of any species of organism on this planet possible, such that, without those environmental conditions, we have no idea how or even if life could if a human being, let's say, could be born on another planet and not be completely deformed. And so it really does redirect our attention, or I hope it would, to how fragile this planet is and the extent to which, if life's going to survive, it's going to need to survive here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's hubristic to think that we could just, go to some other Earth and start all over again and do the same stupid things we're doing here. I actually published a paper in the astrobiology literature saying, what are we doing looking for life on other Earths? We don't even understand what it constitutes here. This is really stupid. And I use that word guardedly. I mean, my granddaughter hates it when I say something stupid. It's not PC, but it is stupid. It's very, my theory of human evolution is, we know that our heads and brain and the contents got bigger and bigger as we evolved. And then we got to the point where we couldn't fit through the birth canal anymore. So we're born with only about 25% of adult brain volume. That's why it takes 20, 30 years to mature, okay? That's why we need families and social systems as the extension of the niche construction that extends from us, because you have to have a protected space. Either we have law of the jungle, fight or flight, or problem solve. You cannot problem solve if you're living in the jungle, okay? If it's a hand-to-mouth existence. This is why what's happening now in society here is so crazy to me. It's really undermining everything that we hold to be true. But we don't even realize the harm we're doing, because without even truth with a small t, you have to have some set of values in order to be able to make those calls as to what the right or wrong thing to do is. In reality, we don't really understand causation. We don't understand the ontology and the epistemology. And so we keep making these systematic errors. But in the interim, we do okay until everything sort of falls, goes to hell in a handbasket. I honestly don't think we can afford that anymore. We need to experience the age of reason and the Enlightenment 2.0. And somebody was saying they don't like the idea of inflection point. I was watching something, but anyway, we are at an inflection point, and I think that with 7 billion people, maybe going to 11 billion people, and resources dwindling, we can't afford to make mistakes. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources, and we really don't have the enough degrees of freedom to do that anymore. We've got to do the right thing, in my opinion. Why is it we're the only organism on the planet that's destroying ourselves and the planet in the bargain? So what I was saying, so that the reason that we evolved through this strategy of remaining in a juvenile state. We're hairless, we're narcissistic, we're risk takers. We go for instant gratification. All the juvenile behaviors. There are benefits. Creativity and a lust for life and a driving force, but there are liabilities too, as we all recognize. So my sense is that we really have to realize. So the reason I think that that's true is because all great apes have this structure in their cerebrum called the area of Broca, which brings together tool making and language, which is why when you have a stroke, you lose, have a hemiparesis, you can't talk. Okay, the difference between you read the paper about the central theory. The difference between us and every other great ape is we stand on two legs, creating that selection pressure for this and for tool making and for language. So, Wittgenstein talks about prose in which you have the verb constrained by subject object, as opposed to poetry, which is much more free and flowing as energy. So, the poets are way ahead of us. In one of Robert Frost's notebooks, he says, life is that which can dissolve oil in water. That's what I've been talking about. He's right. And there's that poem he wrote about the secret. We dance round and round, and the secret sits in the middle. We're constantly, sort of circling this truth, but we never get to it because it's, first of all, because we're built that way. I like Bohm. I think Bohm is correct, and we'll never get to that asymptote of the implicate order, because that's not our mission. It's not our, if we were to become one with the implicate, we would be silicon life forms or something. I don't know what we would be. Anyway, but my point is that we have to be free to be able to constantly strive for that implicate order. imperfect as we are in the X, look at that, because that is what our purpose, in my opinion, is. So, sorry, I'm rambling on here, but
Oh, very interesting. To bring it back to Whitehead for a minute and sort of what you were getting into about the state of our society and our species at the moment. We have a sort of individualistic understanding not only of the human being and human society, where it's, society is something we imagine was sort of created by contracts between individuals. Whereas in a Whiteheadian view, there's more of a dialectic between the individual and society, and not just at the human scale, but his ontology itself, right, describes actual entities which form societies, which are these sort of enduring forms or relationships among actual entities. And the environment shapes the nature of the entity, and the entity shapes the nature of the environment. And it's kind of a niche or niche construction theory writ large. He'll describe the way that in the early phase of the universe, a few 100,000 years after the Big Bang, that protons and electrons, in a way analogous to Margulis's symbiogenesis hypothesis, they formed a relationship with one another that was enduring. They're still around, tens of billions of years later. But this relationship between protons and electrons transformed the whole environment, right? As did the emergence of stars and galaxies. And so there's, in the biological realm, the story of the origin of life now is typically looking for that individual heroic cell that finally pulled off the feat of maintaining itself and reproducing itself. The work, I've been collaborating with a team, including David Deamer. I've been working with Bruce Damer, one of David Deamer's colleagues. They're developing this so-called hot spring hypothesis for the origins of life in freshwater pools, rather than the deep sea hydrothermal vent theory. And what their research is showing is that life originated more in a network or a community of protocells, and that the process of combinatorial selection before there were genomes or anything, it's just liposomes, little packets of chemistry that through a cycling process of dehydration and rehydration in these shallow pools, there was the sort of beginnings of a selection process of the sorts of chemistry that would allow for these liposomes to survive longer. But the point is, in the dry cycle, they form this gel, and the successful chemical strategies for surviving get shared among this whole network. And that their idea is that this network of relationships was essential for for highly improbable chemistry to become more probable, because successful strategies could then be shared so that the next generation could then utilize them. So it's more like the hero's plural story rather than the individual hero story of how life originated. And I think this has social implications, for human beings now, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the underlying idea of cooperativity being the basis for life is critically important. It's not, hammer and tongs. It's not bloody claw. It's cooperativity, which is actually, The one thing I would add, I don't know, I mean, Deamer was a friend of a close colleague of mine when I was in graduate school, when we were at Berkeley. So that's how I knew Dave, and through this guy, and Dave came and lectured at Harvard UCLA, where my lab was. At any rate, but the thing that I've been compelled by is the hysteretic capacity of lipids. Because if you think about these lipids floating on the surface of the primordial ocean, if you will, they're warmed by day and they liquefy and they enlarge, if you will. And then at night, when it gets cold, they go back to their original form. And as they're cycling like that, they're trapping calcium. And eventually the calcium can be toxic if it's there in too high a level. So our forebears figured out how to form calcium ion channels. So the calcium was now going to flow through. And that was the basis for, cells and neurons as professional calcium transducers, if you will. I think that and again, it's hard. We know that that's true because you can make liposomes in the laboratory. That's how you do it. And I think, David provided Deemer had provided a primary evidence that there were the vestiges of that. And so, yeah, I think the message of cooperativity, which has up until now largely come out of the philosophical end of the pond, I think it's important for people to realize that we evolved through cooperativity, not through competition. I mean, there's competition, sure, but it's healthy competition. It's not destructive. Cancer is destructive. Cancer is the antithesis of cooperativity. And we wrote a paper on that actually. But I did write a paper about niche construction too. The unicell is the first niche construction. When I came across that idea several years ago, I thought, this is trivial. I mean, this is kind of, kindergarten stuff. And then I thought, but wait a minute, but if the unicell was the first niche construction, that's interesting. Because then it's like this movie and book by Sean Carroll about the Serengeti rules. That's what he's talking about in that movie, the ecological cooperativity of organisms, which apparently there was a big breakthrough several years ago when some ecologist realized that starfish were really important in a tide pool. He pulled the starfish out, the whole ecosystem collapsed. Threw the starfish back in, everybody's happy again. Yeah, it's like that.
Right. So, I mean, the role of competition, I think, especially among animals, is pretty clear with predator-prey relationships. But as you point out in your papers, the vast majority of the history of life on Earth was not at the multicellular level. It was at the single cell level, and bacteria seem to, they share genes with each other, right? They share genes in response to changes in the environment. And more now, we're discovering even animals. In addition to the Lamarckian effect of acquired characteristics through epigenetics that you're discussing earlier, there's also lateral gene transfer. It appears even among animals now. I think especially in fish. Margulis was trying to make this case too, but that research has advanced, and it seems far more prevalent than we ever would have thought. And so the old Darwinian story, of the separation between the sex cell and the somatic cells, and the way that there's just a lineage and that you can't share across lineages, that's all breaking down. And so it really does feel like there's a whole new territory, unexplored territory in biology. Do you have the sense that we're on the verge of some kind of what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift, or do we need more research before we can make claims like that?
No, I think we're on the precipice, because the existing paradigm is not predictive, and it's not fulfilling the mission of even getting us towards a predictive model. We were supposed to have had at least 100,000 genes in the human genome. If a carrot has 40,000 genes, well, we're at least twice as smart as a carrot, right? Turns out, I think last time I looked, we have like 19,000 genes. It's because of the cooperativity. Apparently Dawkins and Sheldrake, these guys are going down in flames. People are realizing that their ideas are very anthropocentric, and that we need a new paradigm. Yeah, we need a paradigm shift. Wow. So I actually have you ever seen the Gregory Pincus, the Stewart biochemist who invented the pill? He actually did a couple of really cool experiments. He took the oocytes from rabbits, and he just punctured them, and then he put them back in the rabbit. Rabbit was primed to gestate, and he demonstrated polyandry. What is it called? Polyandry? Yeah, parthenogenesis. And in fact, he then took the animals from the parthenogenic experiment and mated them with wild types, and he got offspring. So my point being that this whole concept of sexual reproduction, it really goes back to the unicellular state. The unicellular state is still prime. You can make an end run on it experimentally. Yeah, so there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of dogma that is getting in the way of the truth, in my opinion. Things like pleiotropy, the fact that the lens of the eye has the same enzyme in it that your liver does. Well, how does that work? It's probably why we have drugs that have so-called side effects. They just showed there's some chloride pump that Zantac, I guess, inhibits some chloride pump in the lower esophagus for acid reflux. Turns out it's screwing up people's kidneys. It's the same damn gene that's in your kidneys. So if you do too much of it, you get sick. Duh. But these are important anecdotes, but they do bring home the idea that, as you were saying, multicellular organisms are a fairly recent invention, if you will. And in fact, we don't actually go back to the unicellular state. We never left the unicellular state. I talked about that earlier. I think that's important to realize.
Yeah, Margulis used to harp on this, that evolutionary theory was developed by zoologists who study animals. And, if most of the history of life was at the single cell level, we need to understand evolution at that scale, because that's the primary process that created us.
Helmut Plotner studies planaria. I was collaborating with him and another person a while back. But Plotner shows that if you put a little glucose in the water, the planarian localizes to it. And he showed that, the calcium waves start to flow. And if you block calcium flux, the animal won't, the planarian won't localize to the scent, if you will, whatever it's detecting in the water that's sweet. If you put me in an MRI, put some glucose on my tongue, my brain lights up for the same reason. It's important to realize the common, and I think that just like heliocentrism, the great leap forward after the Middle Ages in the Enlightenment was really the removal of the Earth from the center of the solar system. We have to do the same thing with the biosphere. We have to get over ourselves. I was taught that by zoologists at UCLA, because I used to cop that attitude of, oh, we're so cool. And they said, no. The world is flat. That's wrong. And I agree with them now. I've come to that realization through my own, analysis. But I think it's really important that we realize, that we're the only species that knows that we know that we're mortal. And that scares the bejesus out of us. It's what makes us so neurotic. But I believe that if we understood the cycle of life and we were able to really understand what's going on, I think it would reduce the the noise, the rhetoric, the fear. I like to think. So I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, and I've spent my career trying to introduce new knowledge because I think that the Holocaust was a product of ignorance. It's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but I continue to feel that way, and that's the message I try to share is we haven't seen anything yet. And you were saying that atoms and cells, they are virtually the same thing. Moravitz, the great biochemist, said, well, look, if you look at a hydrogen atom, it's a proton and an electron. They're in homeostatic balance. Same thing is true for the cell. Homeostasis is what determines the cell's existence. And in fact, so by Pauli exclusion principle, the first three are deterministic. The fourth is time-based and probabilistic. I've gone on record to say that the cell is based upon first principles of physiology. I reduced it to negative entropy, chemiosmosis, and homeostasis. Both the atom and the cell exist in that realm between determinism and probability in terms of free will. We have free will, but within limits. It's constrained. So as I think you were saying earlier, because we internalized atoms, physical atoms, we had to comply with the same rules as atoms do. It's all about atoms, really, right? So, yeah.
I mean, Whitehead in Process and Reality, he refers to his ontology as a cell theory of actuality. And he means this to apply it at all scales, whether it's at the atomic scale or at the biological scale, that nature organizes itself in this way, in a cellular form of organization to achieve homeostasis, or, we could use the term autopoesis if you're familiar with that.
Yes, but my exception to autopoesis is that Maturana used that term descriptively, but he never explained why autopoesis occurs. It's that business about the gravity and the cells and the, but I think you need to understand where it comes from. It's a beautiful idea, but if you don't understand the mechanism, the explanation of that, I've been counseled to say, don't use mechanism. Well, that's how it would put food on the table. If you weren't mechanistic, you weren't getting grant money, okay? But so explanation. But my point is, and I hate to be a stickler about it, but I do think it's important to understand causation, because if you don't understand causation and direction and magnitude, you're just going to go, it's like, it's another just so story, right?
Yeah, it's descriptive, it's phenomenological even. I think the effort that Maturana and Francisco Varela were undertaking was to get away from life as a series of characteristics to having a definition for life that was like, what is the essence of life? They came up with autopoiesis, and I think you're right, though, that it's not an explanation for how this is possible, because in your terms, it lacks the mechanism. It's not an account in terms of thermodynamics and an account of the homeostasis that's achieved. But I think it is at least a description that allows us to recognize what's unique about life. Now, the problem for me with autopoietic theory is that it describes the background of physics and chemistry as, I think, too sharply differentiated from what life is doing. And I think we really need to put life back in its cosmic context, evolutionarily speaking, to understand that, as Whitehead would say, there are forms of organization that shelter the emergence of more improbable forms of organization within them. And so Whitehead would refer to the electromagnetic society of actual occasions, which for him was the broadest sort of envelope or membrane, if you want, that establishes a certain form of order. And then within that, you get the emergence of what would be improbable forms of organization, if not for that background state of order, to shield us from, say, the chaos of the quantum vacuum, let's say, right? And this process of the environment enveloping more and more improbable forms of organization within it is part of what, for Whitehead, drives that evolution to complexity.
I maintain that, I think that there's a danger in accepting the equality of the explicate and the implicate. There was no implicate until there was an explicate. You had to form that membrane, that barrier, that boundary. I actually came up with a really crazy idea that I want to run by you. For some reason, I was thinking about the idea of a Mobius strip, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, but the way you make a Mobius strip is you take, the band, the ribbon, you cut it and you twist it once and you reattach it. So that's the continuous surface. And then I realized that, in fact, those lipid molecules, before they formed that membrane, they potentiated a Mobius strip, if you follow what I'm saying. The Mobius strip preceded the existence of the membrane. It's like, if you've ever read Husserl's explanation of the origin of geometry, he says it's not an external thing. It's not triangles and circles and stuff. It's in our heads. We're just projecting it onto the page. It's internal. It's like Plato's archetypes, that idea. I think that the Mobius strip is really internal to us. We recognize that continuum because it's our origins. It's the prima facie basis for life. See what I'm saying? Yeah. That's why I think that the conceptualization of the unicell and the cell membrane and its power is so important, because it opens up all these interesting doors that are now dogmatic. There was some guy I'm on that in the Consciousness Studies Society, and they had a video of some Irishman who claims to be able to, act as a medium. And he was so compelling and he was so cool. And I thought, well, wait a minute, but if, as you're meditating, if I'm right about going back to the gut brain, and then you even go back to some people may be able to go back to the skin brain. Now that makes sense to me, that there's nothing between you and the cosmos but that membrane, right?
Yeah, no, it's almost like naturalized Platonism, in the sense of what Plato called anamnesis, or recollection, that we can remember the prior stages of evolutionary history because they are enfolded within us.
Yeah.
So in your view, then, would it be more appropriate to think of our own bodies as a kind of cellular ecology, and that we are, in fact, some kind of ecosystem of cells, not just thinking of an ecosystem spatially, but temporally or diachronically, as you do? And
Yeah.
if we do that, then in terms of the unit of selection being the single cell, what do you think about the work that Margulis did with James Lovelock around the Gaia theory and this notion that for life to maintain itself long enough to evolve into more complex creatures like us, that there needs to be that planetary feedback loop to regulate the composition of the atmosphere and so on. Otherwise, as the sun heats up, life would have gone extinct long ago, unless it's almost like niche construction writ large again, that the whole planet had to be terraformed by bacteria in order for it to maintain the habitability of the planet for more complex life to emerge. So in other words, is there any place for Gaia as the unit of life, which is sort of required for evolution to get beyond the level of bacteria?
Absolutely. So Nick Christakis is an epidemiologist, but he's an MD. But he developed his contagion theory. He actually is able to through computer modeling, show that human systems are interconnected. So he's already describing the mathematical expression. But as I was saying earlier, the idea of niche construction and that it's bones enfolding and unfolding, but that goes all the way from the unicell to Gaia in my mind's eye. Yes, everything's interconnected. And I don't know if in anything that I wrote that I toiled for years with, I suffered for years with trying to understand. I knew stress had something to do with evolution. My professor at McGill was Hans Selye. He coined the term stress. So I cut my teeth on Hans's stuff. And then I realized that because there's this phenomenon by which if you cause stress in a multicellular organism, when the blood pressure rises and blood flow increases through the microcirculation, the capillaries, it causes shear of the wall of the vessel that generates these radical oxygen species, which have been shown to cause gene mutations and duplications. So what I'm saying is that you have a homeostatic state, like a glomerulus or an alveolus or whatever structure you want to think of. And when homeostasis fails and you're in a dishomeostatic state, you generate these radical oxygen species, and the cells are trying to re-achieve homeostasis. And in so doing, it's what we call evolution. It's internal selection. It's not external, by and large. I mean, there's some room for what Darwin described, but that's anecdotal. The real process. So, for example, Neil Shubin's Tiktaalik, this quadruped that crawled out of water onto land. Nobody's ever, concerned themselves with what was happening inside the animal. It was all about, you went from fins to legs. Yeah, but the internal organs also had to adapt, and that's how that happened, through that stress. Increased gravity, gravitational force from buoyancy to land existence is what actually fostered all of the organs of the body that adapt to land. And if you mess with any of them, like the PTHRP gene, if you delete the PTHRP gene, you don't form alveoli, you don't form a skin barrier, you don't form a glomerulus. It's critical. It's critically important to that transition, and we know that it's a mechanically regulated gene. And I'm not, I'm still toying with, well, was it the skeleton, because Wolff's law, and it's the skeletal adaptation selected for those subset of Tiktaalik that had the capacity to have a greater signaling quality, and so that then translated into glomeruli in the kidney. So fish have glomuses. It's a very primitive vasculature for exchange of fluids and electrolytes with through the tubules, but then you get this vascularization, with neovascularization, which PTHRP mediates because it's an angiogenic factor, for example. My point being that it's all there, and we've seen it every time you do a gene deletion, but people don't think that way. And even if they thought that way, they can't get it published. I can't tell you how nasty the editors of the traditional evolution literature have been. They call me an idiot. I don't understand science. I don't understand evolution. Go away. Don't bother me. It's become a religion. It's a cult, which is not healthy.
Yeah.
It's healthy for students.
Yeah, I think this is the whole issue of the sociology of science, we could say, and the role that paradigms play when people make their careers on an old paradigm. They're not going to let it go easily. And I think in terms of the public understanding of science, all of this politics really gets black boxed, right? And what people think science is just sort of spitting out facts and new theories, not seeing the mess of what goes on behind closed doors and the battles for publication. But the danger here is that if you open up the black box, like when, with climate science, when the emails were released a few years ago for some of the IPCC scientists, I don't remember if you saw that, but the public got to see how scientific facts are constructed in a way, not that there isn't a reality that's being used to test, theories and different models, but the public, when exposed to what goes on in the black box, can go to the opposite extreme and say, oh, well, science is just as bad as politics now. And I think that's dangerous, because it's not just like that. Even if there is some inertia and it takes a while for new paradigms to emerge, it's still, I would say, the best method that we have for approaching the truth. So, I mean, is there any sense from your experience that, you would make recommendations about how science is institutionalized and how we might make more room for these leading edge approaches that don't fit with the old paradigm? Or is this just the way it's always going to go?
Well, I think that binary thinking is very, life is not a binary, it's holistic. I think of it like, I used to canoe the Delaware River here all the time and, as a kid. And it's, the experience of going down the river, you hear the rapids, you see the rocks, you make a choice. But when you look back, there were many choices. So, when you formulate a hypothesis, it's a binary, but that's a scientific method. However, I think that the key is to what I've done over 50 years, which I don't recommend, but the ability to link those hypotheses in a way where and that's what I did. I went from one set of ideas to another, and they did follow in a certain progression, but I was using the template of embryogenesis, for example. So there is a well-recognized paradigm, if you will. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there has to be a better way to do this. I'm sorry, I was thinking of something to say to you about that. I mean, I think that the whole enterprise of science is to think out of the box. But the problem is when you do that, I just got a paper rejected by the Consciousness Journal. The reviewers really didn't understand what I was talking about. I mean, they're so imbued with the idea that mind is brain. This is not good. And we know that that's, there are other options. And that it's not merely opinion, it's testable and demonstrable. So yeah, it's, you know that we're in a crisis mode in biomedical research worldwide for this very reason. I mean, when I sat on study section at NIH, nobody ever discussed whether the hypothesis had merit. It was only whether it could be tested, whether the scientist's tools were sharp enough to distinguish the hypothesis from the null hypothesis. The philosophy of what they were talking about went by the wayside. I don't know whether that's because we gave up on logical positivism, whether we become very cynical. I don't know what's going on, but both of my mentors, my lab director discovered aldosterone serendipitously, and he let the world know that it was purely through serendip that he discovered this major hormone. And my mentor at Harvard, she discovered the cause of this disease of preterm newborns that was killing them. And it was the obverse. It was 180 degrees out of whack with the conventional way of thinking. People thought that these kids were inhaling in utero fibers, which ended up in their airways that caused them to become asphyxiated. It was the other way around. But she was a logical person and she knew the science well enough to be able to test it and demonstrate it. But she couldn't get her paper. The first paper that was published was in a throwaway journal, Archives of Childhood Diseases. And she always told that story because she was encouraging us not to be afraid to think outside of the box. I mean, that's what we get paid for. And yet everybody, gets rewarded if they're just, incrementally pushing the rock up the hill, and it's some guru, some major player's pet hypothesis. That's not good. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to encourage in my role with the Cobb Institute is more dialogues like this between philosophers and scientists who are doing research, so that there can be this. I mean, Whitehead described it as the flight of an aeroplane, where you need to start with, the best research and laboratory science available, the evidence, in other words, and then you can take a flight into the thin air of imaginative generalization, he says, to see what might the implications of this be for other fields, in other disciplines. And you're not allowed to do that as a research scientist. You need to stay in this incremental path as you're describing. And I think it's in dialogue across disciplines, just across disciplines of scientific disciplines even. I don't know how often you get to talk to evolutionary biologists or evolutionary developmental biologists or molecular biologists, but there's so much fragmentation even within biology, right? Or within medicine, I'm sure. So we need to build bridges, I think, between disciplines, have more conversations with philosophers who are allowed to be speculative, at least some of us, if we're not analytic philosophers, because I think that's in those conversations, that's where the pathways toward these breakthroughs happen. Because yeah, when I look at the history of science, most of the major discoveries were happenstance, accidental, or just a dream or a vision that comes to someone. And it's not this incremental logical process, as important as that is.
No, it's people try to frame it as a rational, like they talk about rational chemistry or something like that, in that idea, but it's not. It's always counterintuitive, and gee whiz, and that should be telling us something. And people have given, the great minds like Prigogine and Polanyi, and more recently, who was it? Somebody similarly, Sheldrake, I think, basically said, biology is too complicated. We can't understand it. I think it's because they're not really thinking imaginatively. I mean, I always attribute my ability to think in this sort of holistic way to the fact that I was an English biology major in college, and I'm on one side of Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. I'm learning, I'm in a poetry class. The professor reads the poem. He dissects the bejesus out of it, but you never could leave the room until you put it back together again. On the other side of the street, when I'm in biolab and I'm dissecting a frog, the frog parts are sitting there on the bench. Nobody cares. It's all about reductionism. And that's why I did cell culture for my entire career, largely to be able to put Humpty together again. And if it didn't work, you could actually do experimentation to figure out what was missing, because there were things missing in the gemisch. Yeah, but I'm not a typical scientist. I'm not interested in the technology only as a tool, not as a lifestyle. So yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem, and nobody in this whole debacle over the crisis in biomedical research, they point fingers at the funding mechanism, people that are doing, 5 postdocs, and, it's all about the machinery of the existing paradigm. They never consider the possibility that we're using the wrong paradigm. This
right.
is not good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love that example.
I think that we desperately need to understand that we're making a systematic error.
Yeah. Yeah.
But nobody really wants to face it, and this is the right time to pose that question, in the aftermath, hopefully, of this pandemic, because man, we did a lot of things wrong, and we thought we had everything under control. Bullshit. And I don't see it any differently from the aftermath of 9/11. After 9/11, people, the intelligence community wasn't talking to one another. Well, why weren't they? Because they were on cruise control. I think people are mentally lazy. They have to be challenged. And I do think that, so here's the thing that's curious to me. I know we're over time, but are you familiar with knot theory?
I've peripherally studied a bit of topology, but not knot theory in particular. So
Okay.
I don't know too many details.
Yeah, Luke Kaufman is on the Zoom that I participate in. He's one of the major players in knot theory. And in his lecture, he's saying Well, the test of a true knot is it can be unknotted as a circle. I thought, that's interesting. A cell is a circle too. There are painfully true homologies between the mathematics of knots and biology. They're the same thing. And similarly, Peter Rowlands is a mathematician, physicist at the University of Liverpool who's devised this whole mathematical system of his own. The central features of that rewrite system of his, it's the same as epigenetic inheritance. My point being that we already recognize these mathematical models, but we don't see the relationships, and yet they're there. Mm-hmm. So my point being that, as you were saying, I mean, it's very, very difficult to go across disciplines. It's hard enough to go across within disciplines. I mean, it took how long? 25 years for the adult pulmonary people to realize that what was happening to the infants was impacting on their population until they started to see it. But other than, I mean, it should have been obvious to them. I always thought, well, what the hell are you doing? Of course, it's going to impact on your practice. But they had to see it. They had to experience it. Clinicians are not very creative, fortunately for all of us. But it is a problem when they determine who gets the grant money. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's almost like we need a new type of science. And I guess in some ways, complex systems theory is an attempt to do this, but a science of the relationships among disciplines, so that somebody is being paid to do the research to connect the disciplines rather than just working within them. And I'm not, as I said, a trained scientist by any means, but I like, as a philosopher, to be in dialogue with scientists and to learn as much as I can about physics, about biology, about psychology, to see where these analogies may exist. And then I go back to the experts and say, does this work? And they say, no way, or they say, maybe. And I think we just need to, in a way, institutionalize this inter or even transdisciplinarity. And I love the example you gave from your own education, studying poetry while studying science. Whitehead was not just a mathematician and philosopher, he was an educational reformer and did as much work as an administrator trying to convince the science departments that he worked in to make sure that their graduates did not leave the university without studying history and literature and poetry, without having been exposed to philosophy and without knowing the history of their own discipline. Because often you can major in whatever special science and you don't even know the prior paradigms of your own discipline, much less the history of science or philosophy as such. It's so important.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's this burgeoning idea of Daniel Christian is a historian from Australia, and he fostered this idea of big history.
Right.
So he teaches history from, the Big Bang to contemporary, society. Mm-hmm. For example, and I published a paper in their journal saying you can't understand history unless you understand evolution. They're intimately interrelated, and they offer opportunity for prediction, in my opinion. What I was going to say, what I just said to you about the mathematics, if in fact I'm right, and I think other people think the same thing, that the explicate order was created by this membrane, it's topology. Why wouldn't you think topologically? So what I was going to say to you is, some proof of principle is important. So I'm thinking about writing a paper like that. And if you're interested in co-authoring it, I'm happy to do so, because we desperately need that kind of thinking. I just came across this guy who's at NYU who's written about memory and time and synapses, and how there's this way of thinking about synaptic development, neurons, but it has no context. He's right, but it's not contextually relevant in the sense that it's taken out of context. And so it sounds wonderful, but it's going nowhere, in my opinion. And it's yet another false start. So, I was thinking this morning when I was reading these papers, it's like Roy Lichtenstein's Ben-Day dots, that art form. Mm-hmm. Lichtenstein made these, they're like cartoony kinds of things, big, but they're made of these little, what are Ben-Day dots? They're little, it's like pointillism.
Okay.
That's the problem. We all recognize that everything's composed of atoms, but the question is, how do you organize them in a way where you actually understand a predictive model of where we came from and where we're going. So for example, the periodic table is homologous with evolution. I had thought for years, I need a process to understand a process. What process is like evolution? Couldn't think of it. And then I became friendly with this guy at UCLA who has written definitive books on the periodic table. I didn't realize there was so much to it. I just thought it was this wall chart in my chemistry class. Okay. Now it's this thing that comes out of the wall. It's really cool. But my point being that every element is both synchronic and diachronic. Okay. It's both descriptive in the alchemistic sense, but it also is a function of the number of protons in the nucleus. So it has that feature, that dualism. That's what you need. That's the same as ontogeny. So I don't know if I said this, I don't think I have. My sort of epiphany in terms of coherence and wave collapse was you can reduce both ontogeny and phylogeny to cell communication. Now you can overlay phylogeny and ontogeny. All of a sudden, that creates a dynamism that was not there before, right? It's the same idea. Right. So yeah, it's like that. But I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think people, I try desperately to explain what I'm talking about. I in the book I'm publishing, my son is a well-recognized novelist, and he keeps saying, "Pop, it's too complicated. People don't try and make it understandable for somebody like in the 6th grade." Fine. You know, the problem is that Kuhn said that when the paradigm shifts, the language shifts. If you still are stigmatized by the same language and you have to explain something that's not within the paradigm, that's a tongue twister, right? Anyway, my point being, so I wrote a short story about the bubble family, trying to explain like what Diemer talks about in terms of that kind of, you know, fantasy. I don't know.
I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that that story of yours. By the way,
I actually also wrote a poem about how I was I spent most of my undergraduate time in the pool hall on campus because I thought there was the answer to action at a distance was on a pool table and not in my physics class. And I explained how I finally realized the error of my ways. But it's hard because it takes a lifetime to realize where have you come from, where are you going, why are you going there? You know. Anyway, yeah. So sure, I'd be interested in your feedback.
Yes.
And I highly laud your interest and your passion, and somehow there has to be a way forward, because what we're doing now is well, it's self-destructive.
Yeah,
as far as I'm concerned. So
yeah, I mean, we need to understand life in order to know how to live, and so this sort of research is of not just epistemological significance, but ethical and existential and perhaps even spiritual significance.
I agree.
So yeah, let's say this is part one. I need to wrap it up here, but I'd love to continue the conversation and you know, pursue some of those threads you mentioned around topology, because that intersects with Whitehead actually quite deeply. Part 4 of Process and Reality is all about what came to be called mereotopology, and it's sort of Whitehead's understanding of whole-part relations in what he called the extensive continuum, which is his theory of space-time. And so he really wanted to replace our metrical understanding of space-time, which is still, it was Newton's approach, it was still Einstein's approach, with a topological understanding of space-time in terms of the relationships of wholes and parts established by his actual occasions or his concressing entities, which for him are what are primary, what are most concrete. Space-time, the topology of space-time is emergent from the concrescence of actual occasions in Whitehead. I hate to throw all that out right at the end of this, but I think there are some interesting avenues to explore there in terms of the analogy to embryogenesis, because I think that was physiology was just as important for Whitehead's metaphysics as physics. He was really trying to integrate these two. And so, being able to kind of compare notes with your understanding of the development of the ontogeny of a multicellular organism, I think there will be, I'm sure, analogies with Whitehead's understanding of the universe as a whole and its evolution. So Yeah.
Yeah.
Final words, and then we'll re-engage this next time.
Yeah, I said that I had come and lectured, and it's the only time in my entire career I got a standing ovation. And I had to think to myself, I must have hit some, I must have been close to what you're talking about. And our audience recognized that. I had a conversation with Phil Clayton before I left LA, and Phil was really not very enthusiastic about what I was talking about. I don't know why. I just, I think he's more into the, when Krishnamurti says to Baum, the way to get to cosmic consciousness is to relinquish your ego, that kind of flipping a switch, as opposed to what I think is a rheostatic kind of stepwise process. That's the sense I got from Clayton. But yeah, I mean, I understand that. I think it's really hard to disabuse yourself of your ethos, your way of thinking about the world, and moving in a different direction.
Yeah.
And all I can tell you is I never thought about my science in this way until I fell in this rabbit hole. And I can't, my wife's not very happy that I'm so fixated on the science, but it just seems to keep yielding interesting kinds of thoughts. So yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been fascinating, and as I said, I look forward to part 2. So thank you, John.